Hi, everyone. Welcome to another ScheerPost interview. Today, Diego and I are interviewing Matt Hoh as an expansion on Bob's interview with him on Sheer Intelligence last week. Matt was the first senior military officer during the Afghanistan war to resign in protest of the war's expansion in 2009. And he recently ran a campaign for Senate in 2022. So thanks for being with us here today, Matt.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me join you guys.
So we wanted to get started with this interview that Bob and you talked about a little briefly last week. This Hillary and Condoleezza Rice interview with Jon Stewart, who used to kind of be an idol of some sort of mine,
hmm
and I think a lot of people on the left. Where did you have any thoughts on the interview now that I think we've all watched it? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, to be upset with Rice or Clinton for their retelling of the Iraq and Afghan and Libyan and Syria and other wars, like their tenures, it's kind of foolish. I mean, we should understand who these people are, and that their narrative is what's important to them, and that's what they will always put forward. It is more, I think, the frustration that Jon Stewart, who I think to a lot of us was a hero, because particularly in the early days of the Iraq War, he was very forceful. He was very. I mean, I remember he used to on his show used to call it Mesopotamia. MESS. Right. I mean, like, and that time coming back from the war in '05 and watching his show and seeing him kind of challenging it and depicting it for the farce that it was, and so brilliantly doing it and doing it with comedy, which you can go back to, oh gosh, I can't remember if it was Socrates or who said, the tragic and the comic are intertwined as light and shadow, right? I mean, the two derive from one another. And, I mean, so the skewering of the war that Stewart was doing in '05, when I was freshly home from there, that was in many ways revelatory, because here was someone openly speaking the things that I was thinking. And his willingness to do that and to take it on when, you know, at that point, if you go back, yeah, there was '04, there was opposition against the war, '05, but it was still, we had just reelected Bush in November of '04. That was a validation of the war by the American public. I mean, so going into '05 and to have someone like him. And so, by the way, the point being to see this interview and to see the way he just accepts what they say without pushback. And some of it may be because maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he's not as familiar with what, say, occurred in Libya as he was with what was happening in Iraq in '04 and '05. So there may be some ignorance at play here, which is a very real thing. I mean, what people actually know or what they don't know informs their opinions, as we all know. So, but it was frustrating to watch and disappointing. But at the same time, too, he's got a big contract with Apple TV. I mean, I don't think he's not on Comedy Central anymore.
yeah.
I mean, this is a major platform that has received a ton of advertising, and his guests have been, a lot of them have been very establishment, and that's what Apple wants. I'm sure that's what his producers wants. That's what he wants, and he wants to be this kind of, I think, as I kind of take it, his credibility is now, as he gets older, this honest broker. And what you see, though, is oftentimes with those honest brokers, what they're really just concerned about is the transaction and
Yeah.
making sure that in the future he has guests like Clinton or Rice, that type of level, right? So yeah, but
Right.
overall, I think like a lot of people felt very disappointed with it.
Yeah, and it kind of symbolized to me a little bit of like the fall of the uh it was like the signing the death warrant of the anti-war left in the mainstream media at all, because Stewart kind of accepted this this like perspective from them that was are okay to some extent, and we need to figure out how we can more efficiently do them, as opposed to begging the question of whether systemically these are rotten to their core. And then on the issue of Ukraine, it seemed like Jon was in complete agreement with everything that they said about Ukraine, which is kind of interesting considering a lot of the stuff that he was against in Afghanistan that you spoke out about, like how you said in this interview in The Nation that you had a kill list in Afghanistan, but nothing on reconciliation. And you were told by leadership that that's for the Afghanis to decide. And also our preconditions for peace were non-starters. That all sounds a lot like what's going on in Ukraine right now. You have people like Congressman Raskin saying that the progressives advocating peace talks in Ukraine are revealing a colonialist reflex. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I didn't, but I can see him saying that.
And then of course he's ignoring the peace talks Ukraine wanted that were interfered with by Boris Johnson when so like, what do you think of that? Is that an accurate kind of analogy that this is kind of almost marking the end of the anti-war left in the mainstream at all with someone like Stewart?
I'm not going to subscribe to the death notice of that, but I think that it shows the co-option that can occur, right? It shows the coercion, the manipulation that can occur. It shows the strength of narrative and power. It begets us to really dig into how do we inform, how do we educate. How do we coordinate on the left? How do we provide alternative forms of media that stand up to the official dictations that come from the American government? Kind of transmitted right through CNN, MSNBC, Fox, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, whoever. Pornography that occurs when we talk about American foreign policy and American war from the established media. I mean, we have to remember how not just compliant, but how complicit the American media was with the wars in Iraq, the wars in the war in Afghanistan, the wars throughout the entire Muslim world. I mean, certainly the adversarial journalism that may have existed during the Vietnam War no longer existed. And both sides, both the American government, American military, and the American media had learned from that. Certainly the American government and American media knew that it does not make sense at all for their purposes to have an adversarial media. That how can we co-opt, how can we befriend, how can we induce them, and certainly I think this as we've seen, particularly in the last 20 years, the aspects of access journalism and how, the need to have access is so crucial to, particularly those who do foreign policy or national security reporting. If you don't say something the way the Pentagon wants you to say it, you're not going to get a pass into the Pentagon press briefing. So there's those like very real. And then certainly the media understanding of war, it's good for their ratings. It's good for their profits. It's good for it gets clicks. It gets people to watch. And certainly I'm old enough to, I was a senior in high school during the first Iraq War in 1990, 1991. And I remember watching that war on CNN, and so that was also too a big milestone for cable news and modern media, that war, because it was something that hadn't really occurred before in the sense of watching the war as if it's a movie, as if it's a TV show. And having it in our living, like that type, all that kind of thing. So all this is decades upon decades of learning, of receiving inducements to do the wrong thing, basically, right? And you look at the leaders of the American war. You go back to say a guy like General Petraeus. What did he write his PhD dissertation on? It was on his PhD work was on the Vietnam War, but specifically he talked about the American media's relationship to that war and the lessons he got from it. And so you see, like in the beginning of the Iraq War, this embedding process where journalists are brought into like boot camps, and then they're sent over to the war embedded within American units, and they sleep with those young, they sleep in the same rooms, and they eat with, and they go on patrol with all these young men and young women who, they're young kids. You're going to love them, so how are you going to write something bad about that? I mean, just the way it was shaped and molded and controlled. And then, of course, the relationship between those in government, those in the Pentagon, and of course, those in the media. They all go to the same cocktail parties. They're all sending each other Christmas cards, those types of things. I mean, you have all these different levels that help you understand, how do you have a media structure? How do you have a media that can continually go along with the same wars, that say, that look at the wars, right? And don't say, look, it's all the same people. These are all the same 300, 400 people in charge of these wars, going back years, going back decades. It's the same people. I mean, I remember having this experience when I was in the Pentagon, actually. And I was standing there with a friend of mine. She was a Navy officer. And I don't know what we were doing, but like Don Rumsfeld came up to us. We were at some event or something. And Secretary Rumsfeld comes up to us, and we were standing in front of a portrait of Eisenhower. And Rumsfeld says to us, "You know how old I am? I used to work with that guy. That's how old I am." And the thing about it was not how he said I knew him or anything. I used to work with him, And if you understand Eisenhower, when Eisenhower was a young officer, he knew Civil War officers, right? Yeah. So, I mean, the timeline between all these things is much shorter than I think we ever realize, how interconnected our generations are. But also, too, it's the same people over and over again who, so where is the media saying, look, these are the same people? The same people who are running the Ukraine war, they're the same people who were involved in the American wars all through the Muslim world. And then their connections to the American wars in Central America. And then their connections back to the American wars in Southeast Asia. I mean, all those connections are there. They all worked with each other. They were all friends. They grew up under one another, like that kind of thing. So the fact that, this, I think, explains, and then of course you get a much larger context, and all this is important because none of this happens without, this is a case where, you do have to sum all the parts to understand how it all works. And then you have the massive financial aspects involved in all this, right? Where the media companies, of which there are only about 5 in the United States now, they own about 95% of the media, right? But if you look at how our economy is structured, how how 95% of the S&P 500 is owned by 5 money firms, right? 5 money management firms, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, et cetera. They're the principal shareholders in 95% of the S&P 500. So you understand how financially these board of directors are all tied together, and how Exxon's concern is somehow CNN's concern, which is, of course, Paramount Films' concerns, which is the Pentagon's concern. All these things roll together. It's all interconnected. And I think, you could deconstruct an interview by a guy like Jon Stewart with Hillary Clinton and a Condi Rice, and arrive at this understanding of like, this is how the entire system is.
Yeah, and to speak more about this connection, I noticed this theme, I guess, between what you said last week on Bob's podcast. You said, quote, and because it's not clear, that means that it could not be done better. It strips the morality, the ethics, the human aspects out of these wars and reduces it down to a question of whether or not these things could have been done better. And I feel like I heard that a lot in this interview with Hillary and Condoleezza Rice, the same kind of, and you think about that phrase, mistakes were made, right? That in the Vietnam War, that was kind of the mantra. And also now, I don't know if you saw, but there was a debate on whether you should trust the mainstream media between Matt Taibbi, Douglas Murray, Michelle Goldberg, and Malcolm Gladwell. And the Malcolm Gladwell and Michelle Goldberg represented the mainstream media, and they also kind of had this similar argument of like, yeah, we make mistakes, but it's, you got to keep it, you got to trust us anyways. I mean, that's just how it is. And it just reduces all these it reduces everything down, like you mentioned in your quote, the nuances, the ethics, all this is kind of stripped away. It's like, yeah, I mean, this had to happen, but maybe we'll do better next time.
That's right. It becomes an issue of mistakes were made. I mean, look, this is not this is not just the case for the media or for our foreign policy and war making apparatus, but for all institutions. I mean, I guess probably the most glaring one would say the Catholic Church, right? Where the Catholic Church insists on its authority because of its institutional authority. Meanwhile, they are covering up thousands and thousands and thousands of cases of molestation and child abuse, right? I mean, like what has occurred with the Catholic Church over these decades is so criminal, so evil, right? But it has its moral authority. In that moral authority, because of its status as an institution, which is a really circular authority. I mean, you can't pull that apart. Why does the Catholic Church have its power? Well, it's because it's the Catholic Church. Well, what is there? Why? Oh no, it's the Catholic Church. It's just, I mean, the same thing too. And you have that with the national security establishment. You have that with the mainstream media. A lot of it is who these people are. It's a tight group. It's a small group. Again, they're all friends. They all know each other. But the narrative that they are able to maintain based upon, I think, fundamental assumptions, fundamental truths that are out there. You see that peppered throughout this interview with Rice and Clinton, that America is good, that our intentions are honorable, that we needed, say in the case of Libya, we needed to intervene because Gaddafi was going to kill his people, as Clinton was saying. We had to, all those things. And of course, Rice then chimes in and says the same with Saddam Hussein. He was an evil dictator. We had to take him out. And so you can't, they presented it as like, what are you going to do? You're going to let this dictator murder all his people because you're worried about what the outcome's going to be? And it reduces it to a simplistic, black and white, good versus evil, very Manichaean structure, that has enabled the United States to maintain a militaristic, imperialist foreign policy. You can you say the words American empire, and people think that you are being sarcastic or you're being tongue in cheek, or that you are saying something absurd. That you are too far. It's exaggeration. We don't have an empire, and we have 800 military bases around the world. What do you call that then? But while we have those bases because the world's a dangerous place, and we have to have our bases all throughout Asia and all throughout Europe and the Middle East because of bad people. I mean, that's what this you deconstruct this down to, and that basic assumption is the working assumption that the media then runs with, and then you see that where Stewart doesn't push back. He doesn't push back on the assumption that American military force overseas is meant to protect people, to help people, to spread democracy, whatever, to get rid of evil dictators, as opposed to being the military arm of American empire, and you can go even farther into that. But certainly you see that his unwillingness, as well as then his unwillingness to question just basic things thrown out by Clinton and Rice about this. When Rice says, because we believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, this is where I wanted to turn it off, because Stewart's response should have been, you lied about that. You didn't believe that. You knew he didn't have it, and you lied about it. And, a million Iraqis are dead because of that. But there wasn't that. And I think people's disappointment, just for that one reason, that he, was not the confrontation that needs to occur, because this is what happens when you don't challenge, when you allow for these people like Condi Rice, who should never be in a public space again speaking to people. She should only be, unless she's confessing to her crimes. Right. I mean, and then at that point she pulls a McNamara or something like that. But these people would never do that. And then they're enabled because they are able to get up on, I don't know what Stewart's reach is with this new Apple program, but certainly he has a reach that is equivalent to the biggest political commentators in the United States. Mm-hmm. I imagine that his reach is similar to, his friend Stephen Colbert's, similar to Bill Maher's. I mean, these are the most popular, most prominent political commentators in the United States. And I don't know, again, how well Stewart's program at Apple is doing, but he certainly is there in that type of tier. And this is the type of thing that allows for these wars to perpetuate, for say, even a war like Ukraine, to be put in a separate box. Right, where the Ukraine war, even though it's all the same people on the American side, even though you can trace American military policy, the way that the United States has been setting up its army in Europe, and trace that as coming out of the Iraq and Afghan wars, all these different things. And again, it's the same people involved. Some may say it's a separate box than the wars in the Muslim world are.
Yeah. And sorry. Go ahead, Diego. Go ahead.
Okay. It's just, it's funny because I think what John does is dangerous in that he does have this sort of pseudo pushback where he asks the question if the global kind of like this police state of the United States, if it he asked the question if it has secured stability or has it caused instability, and that's
Right.
not even a question. And I feels like these when you pose questions like that, you begin this process of whitewashing history where it's like is it even a question, if it has caused instability. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering from your yeah.
especially right from the especially because John, sorry to interrupt, but especially because he poses these questions, which I guess you could maybe assume if you're trying to defend John is reasonable when you're interviewing someone like Hillary Clinton or Condoleezza Rice, but then he does not push back on their answers at all, and he allows
Right.
them to enter the framework of no, these are okay, we just need to do them better, ignoring that 73% of the world's dictatorships are funded by the US, when they're saying that we spread democracy across the world. And then
Right.
they said only I think Condoleezza Rice at one point in the interview said something like, oh, we funded a couple of authoritarian governments in Latin America, a couple.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, go ahead, Diego.
Yeah, no, I mean, like hey, look, the thing that I came across recently as I was doing some research was there are 10 nations in the world that have the death penalty for homosexuality. The United States provides military assistance to 7 of them.
Wow.
And the 3 that we don't provide military assistance towards, Iran, Afghanistan, and oh shoot, what was the third one? I can't remember off the top of my head if the third one was, but they're nations that we were heavily sanctioning, right? That we're trying to starve the people, kind of thing. We're not allowing them to have medicine. Yeah, I mean, this idea is preposterous. But the whole structure, I believe, of the Clinton Rice interview with Stewart was preposterous. It comes across to me as like one of those, yeah, maybe you guys see them on your Instagram feeds or you've heard about them, like these master classes that are available, and George Bush will do a master class on, right? I mean, it's preposterous. It's farcical. Like, is this meant to be taken seriously? Is this a Saturday Night Live skit that's popping up in front of me? Like, should I expect Will Ferrell to come out rather than Bush? But, I mean, but it's not. It's not, because these people are part of the elite. These people are part of the establishment. It's all tied together. It's going to the words of George Carlin. It's one big club and you ain't in it. There was several years ago, somebody published, it might've been Matt Taibbi, who published the guest list for Katharine Graham's holiday party. Katharine Graham had been the owner of the Washington Post prior to Jeff Bezos purchasing it. And the Graham family, very well known, established, everything else. But this guest list, everyone was there, kind of thing. I mean, we weren't there, but in a sense of like, it was, the Kushners were there, General Mattis was there, but then also too, like Chuck Schumer was there. You mean all these people that supposedly are objectively different from each other, they all go to the owner of the Washington Post holiday party. Right. And that's not an occurrence. That's not a rarity. That is par. I mean, they all know each other. Everyone's familiar with that photo of Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton standing at Donald Trump's wedding with him, sharing a laugh together and everything. This is who they are. It's all established. It's all intertwined, and their one success depends on the other success. And certainly, you get into institutions, and yeah, of course, get back to the idea of the financial connection between all of them. Some of it's very clear, right? The idea that ExxonMobil's biggest customer is the Department of Defense, right? The biggest fuel purchaser in the world is the Defense Department. Not so clear, say, the connections between, say, a CNN or ABC News. So ABC is probably a good example. ABC News connected, of course, to Disney. They're all under the same parent company. Disney has all its studios. What's the connection between that then and the Defense Department? Well, of course, the Defense Department provides hundreds of millions, if not billions of years of subsidies to the Hollywood studios. And so when you're looking at at the board of director levels, their associations with each other and the desire to keep those subsidies flowing to one part of your conglomerate, of course, will be something that any board of directors is going to acknowledge and understand. And so this is why, and as well, then you get into the access journalism as well, where, particularly I can talk about ABC News because I had, in 2010, a friend of mine who worked at ABC News made some pushback about their coverage of the American surge in Afghanistan. And she was told, we can't do that because it would limit our access. We can't say these kinds of things. I mean, paraphrasing what was said. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, Martha Raddatz was flying on a helicopter with General Petraeus all through Afghanistan. Right. So, I mean, you have all these different levels of how they're all interconnected. Some of it's transactional. Some of it is self-censorship because you don't want to hurt what I mean. Like, so it is. I mean, the interconnection of all this, and the fact that you would then see something like this is put on, this performance is basically put on with Clinton and Rice. Again, it's like one of those master classes where it's not going to be an interview. It's going to be an opportunity for them to tell this thing with some prompting and some subtle pushback from Stewart. I mean, it wasn't like he was egging them on. I mean, this wasn't like it was, this wasn't like Sean Hannity was interviewing them or something like that, right? But it was in the case of not, I think, what any of us who've known Stewart for 20 years or so expect or want to see, and particularly those of us who've lived this and who are living this, those of us who see this, who understand it, folks like, the anger that we have at this. But I think we have to understand that this is par for the course. This is the way it works. And so, what do we do to challenge that? And how do we build? What tools do we have? How can we do things in ways that can counter this messaging, so that the people who are watching the Clinton Rice interview with Stewart, who say, "Oh, Stewart, that guy was an honest broker, man. He's I mean, obviously, if there was more to it, he would have said it." That there's some way that we can inform, and that's a lot of what you guys do, and a lot of what Scheer does, right? What Bob Scheer does. I mean, so like that kind of thing is really important. But yeah, I mean, it is. It's again frustrating to see it, but that's kind of what we're up against.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to hear, like, from your perspective, and you talked about this in Bob's interview about having going on Dan Rather's show, right? And having filmed this whole section, and then them getting an email from some PR firm or something saying this guy's full of shit and all of this, which is not true. And seeing the evolution from that, and I mean, you were still able to get your voice out there. I mean, I've seen,
Right.
you were published in ABC News and several outlets when you first came out. But now for this Ukraine war, you have the Squad publishing a letter calling for peace, and they have to retract it immediately because they immediately get called, Putin apologist, or whatever the catchphrase is, Russian bot, whatever the phrase is.
Yeah, there's the shift that's occurred like with the media in the last 12 years, 13 years is very demonstrable, I think. Certainly when I was on the protest in 2009 and then was on the Today Show and Fareed Zakaria and for months was on cable news over and over again. Like I say, it got to the point with MSNBC actually for years where, the MSNBC studio up by American University, they kept my shade of makeup there, I mean, and because I was on that often. And then a number of things occur. One of them is the way the media, particularly say in MSNBC, shifts to more of the Fox News model, and CNN does this as well, where they just want conflict, where they just want that team red versus team blue. And if you're coming in objectively or neutrally or trying to provide nuance or context, they don't want that. They want the conflict. I had this, so I knew Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas. I knew him in Afghanistan. And when I came back from that, when I quit that war and came back and speaking out against it, and who am I going on television with to talk about the war? But Tom Cotton. He was working for some concerned, some conservative veterans group, and Cotton is an interesting character because he's not the fire-breathing demagogue that he comes across as. He's a Harvard-trained lawyer who is I found to be very soft-spoken, very intelligent, and certainly not the way we see him present himself as a member of Congress. But of course, he understands what he needs to present himself as a member of Congress. So it's, interesting to have known him and to see him what he's like now. And I can say that for others as well who I've met over the years. But the thing with Cotton, though, was so he and I were on a number of programs. We did like Larry King together and stuff like that. And we would have very respectful, cordial disagreements about the war, about what I thought should be done, what he thought should be done. And we did Fox News a number of times. And Fox came one day, Tom calls me or whatever and says, "Hey, we're not going to be doing Fox anymore together." And I said, "Well, what's the issue?" And he said, "Well, I just spoke with one of the producers, and they said that we are too polite to one another. That there's not enough conflict between us, that, it's not good for ratings." And that was winter of 2010, but you see all that shift, and you see the need for the media to get clicks, to get ratings. As things change, as the internet comes on in the 90s, all through the first decade of the 2000s, things are changing. And then by 2010, 2011, 2012, their profit model has really taken a hit, and they have to shift. They have to restructure. They have to do things differently. And so certainly that's why I think there's a number of reasons for it, but what I experienced in 2009, 2010, in terms of having access, that by 2014 had been removed, basically, to the point that you see almost no anti-war voices in the mainstream media, in the established media. We've more or less been removed as a practical aspect of their coverage. But even too, you can have a case with the Washington Post, where the Washington Post covered my resignation, and above the fold, front page, 3,000 word profile of me, basically. And when I asked the associate editor, Karen DeYoung, why she wrote this story on me the way she did, she said, "Well, because everyone I spoke to at the White House, the NSC, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the State Department, et cetera, everyone I asked about what you were saying about Afghanistan, no one disagreed with you, but no one will go on record." And, you could have that happen where the Post does that, and one of their most senior writers writes this big thing, and that's the explanation for it. And then how do you explain 10 plus years of never having anything published by the Post, or ever once being called by a Washington Post reporter? Right. So what you have is this access thing where, as you were alluding to, the Department of Defense, it's not just so much what you say about whether or not you will have access to their generals, to their briefings, to their trips, but whether what you say to others or what others are allowed to say. So the thing you were talking about, where I was being interviewed by Dan Rather, and Dan Rather, this is in 2010 or maybe in 2009, had brought me up to New York City he had a Rather Reports or something like that, which is on a cable show, and spent about 3 hours being interviewed by him. And as we're walking around in Manhattan doing B-roll, he says to me, "I've been going to Afghanistan for decades, and I know you're right about this war." And as I was leaving that interview, his producer came up to me and said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And he hands me an email, and basically says it's from a strategic communications firm, a PR firm that represents Central Command. Central Command is the American warfighting command for the Middle East. It's run by David Petraeus at that point. And it basically says, "Hey, this guy, Matt Hoh, he's lying about who he is. He really didn't experience anything. And basically, if you want to talk to someone like him, we don't think you're the right people to talk to us." And a month or so later, when the thing airs, the Dan Rather special on Afghanistan airs, I'm nowhere to be seen. But similar to like what I said about ABC and Martha Raddatz, there's their correspondent flying around in a helicopter with General McChrystal. So you see how it works, where they have to self-censor. They have to, otherwise they're going to be punished. And so the carrot and stick approach of the American military over the last 20 years has been really incredible. You get to the point where the American mainstream media in the years 2015, 2016, all the way through 2020, basically, are spending 5 to 10 minutes a year total, aggregated, on the war in Afghanistan. As the war gets worse, as more and more people die, as the Taliban gets stronger, as the United States spends $300 million a day, the American media is covering it 5 to 10 minutes a year total, right? I mean, so how is that possible? How do you get to that point? Why are they so willing to do that? And why is there no incentive for them to cover it? I mean, so there's a lot to this that can be pulled apart. And again, a lot of it gets back to what we were talking about with the Stewart interview of Rice and Clinton.
Yeah, well, I did not know we were spending $300 million a day there. That's insane.
Yep. Yeah, you break it down over 20 years, we spent $300 million a day.
Wow. And in your one thing that you mentioned in your interview with Bob was that many of the Iraqi insurgents that you encountered were nationalists, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Both Iraqi and Afghan, yeah.
Yeah. And so regarding the morality of what you were doing there and the way you perceived it, and eventually reaching the decision to resign from the military, how exactly did learning the people that you were fighting, might have actually been a lot more complex than just being religious fanatics that wanted to see the world burn? Like, I know that Obama, one of the references that he used as to why he had to keep fighting the insurgencies in Iraq was that he would reference the Dark Knight movie. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Heath Ledger, and he would say he would make the comment that some people are just so evil or whatever that they want to see the world burn.
And this is the danger of someone like Obama. The danger of someone like George Bush. George Bush famously would say things like, "They hate us for our freedoms." No, I mean, like, very clear. They used to be on YouTube years ago. Haven't been on in years. You could look and watch the martyrdom videos, the suicide videos, and the 9/11 hijackers, and see what they said. You can watch it for yourself. You can't do that anymore. I haven't been able to do that in 15 years probably. But you could see what these guys were saying.
They removed the videos, or
they removed the videos, yeah. And there used to be an organization called Site, SITE, that would have those things posted, and But what you would see, what they would say, what the hijackers said, and of course not condoning or agreeing with them, and but what they were saying would be things like, look, the reason why we are at war with the United States is because the United States has been at war with us. The United States, it's the presence of its military bases all throughout the Holy Land, throughout the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the support for Israel, the sanctions against the Iraqi people that are murdering hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, those things, those are the explanations why the hijackers did what they did on 9/11. Nothing about because your girls, their skirts are too short or something like that, but that's, I just heard Obama do this again in a different subject with Trevor Noah, where he talked about socialism as socialism basically being everybody walks into the store and everything's free and you just take off the shelf whatever you want, right? Like, that was his explanation of socialism to Trevor Noah. And Trevor Noah didn't push back either, because he's probably afraid he'd never get another guest like President Obama again. Right. So but like that just absolutely ludicrous explanation of, say, something like socialism, that's what it would boil down to, and President Obama would describe it that way. I mean, the injustice that it does, the disservice that it does to so many millions of people hearing something like that, who probably don't have who haven't read all kinds of economic history and theory and philosophy and everything. But you see this over and over again. It's very dangerous. And so if Obama says something like, well, we're fighting them because sometimes there are just generally evil people out there. People want to see the world burn. But everything we knew was that wasn't the case. And we knew this. So in Iraq, we knew this because we capture insurgents. We capture Iraqi insurgents, and we capture insurgents who came from other places, to fight us. And even the ones who came from other places to fight us there. You say they'd be interrogated, and why did you come here to fight, in Iraq? They'd be coming from Morocco and from Libya and from Saudi Arabia and from wherever. And they would say, because you're occupying this country, I'm coming to help defend the Iraqi people against you. Or they would say, because I saw the videos from Abu Ghraib, or because I know what's happening in Guantanamo Bay, and I want to defend my people. I want to defend my fellow Arabs. I want to defend our religion. And that of course plays into, say, an organization like Al-Qaeda's greater mythology, right? That they are just part of the arc of history, that this goes back to the Crusades, that they are taking part in something, that is centuries upon centuries of long, and, everything else. But, the understanding of what the insurgency was about was very clear. And we had this all throughout, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and, and the intelligence estimates, the reporting, just you're there and you understood what was occurring. You spoke to the people, you understood that no one wants to be occupied. Nobody wants to be occupied. And the way that the Americans handled the wars, which is the way we've always handled our wars, which we got from the British, a divide and conquer type strategy, pitting one group against another. You say in Iraq, of course, pitting the Sunnis against the Shia versus the Kurds, but even deeper than that, and some of how he handled some of the tribal relations there, which was, I don't want to get too deep into that, but the same thing in Afghanistan too, where you had multiple ethnicities and you basically were able to pit ethnicities against the Pashtuns who are the plurality, and do this divide and conquer type strategy. All of those things, if you understand that and you talk to people and you see it, and then of course you use some empathy and you say, what if this was me? And I had this experience in Iraq when I commanded a company of Marines and sailors, and 153. And I had this understanding that if my young men, if they were young Anbari men, we are an Anbar province, if they were young Anbari men, that, of those 153 that I have with me, 51 would be fighting us. 51 would be in Abu Ghraib, and 51 would have been killed, because there is no difference between my young men and the young men that were fighting us. And the Al Qaeda types, I was there when Al Qaeda in Iraq was broken in late 2006, early 2007, because of the Sunni awakening, the Sons of Iraq, the Anbari revival, whatever they were calling it. It's basically just talking to the insurgency, which is something that should have been done right away. And the same thing that happened in Afghanistan, a refusal to talk. It's kind of seeing a lot of that happening in Ukraine right now, where there's a refusal to allow negotiations to occur. And, but what you saw with the insurgency in Iraq was that as soon as you spoke to the Sunni insurgency and addressed their grievances, when the grievances were very clear, look, you're occupying us, you have separated us from our government, we are being preyed upon by a central government composed of our rivals, we are not receiving any revenue that we used to receive. And so, all kinds of very understandable grievances, whether you agree with them or not, very understandable. As soon as they were addressed, basically give us back control of our lands, give us back control of our provinces, our cities, and our villages, the insurgency just stopped. And what they did next was they said, okay, the Al-Qaeda and Iraq guys are over there. Literally that's what happened. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq, say in Anbar province, was composed of cells of 4 or 5 people strong. That was it. So, that was it. So we'd send in, the task force would come in, and SEALs or Delta, or we'd send in Marine Recon or whoever, and they kill those guys. And that was it. And within weeks, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was gone. Most of them fled to Syria. And of course, that becomes another story, right? That becomes the Islamic State and everything else, which has a very heavy American role in it. But yeah, it's understanding of it as a nationalist, but we were forbidden from saying this. I can't remember if I spoke about this with Bob or not. We were forbidden from using those terms or from explaining that. And if you are, and this goes back again to Stewart and Clinton and Rice, if Stewart had said, well, the Iraqi people didn't want you there, they didn't ask for you to come in and remove Saddam Hussein. Now, granted, most Iraqis are very happy to see Saddam go, but they didn't want to be occupied. They didn't want 20 years of this, where 1 million of them died and 10 some odd million have lost their homes, and the refuge. On and on and on. The horror of it. It's something that we cannot even begin to understand or process here, what they have lived with for the last 20 years, let alone the 20 years before that, whether it would be the sanctions, whether it be the first Iraq war, whether it be 10 years of airstrikes. During the Clinton administration, the United States was bombing Iraq every second or every third day. People forget that, or people maybe don't even know that. And I bet Jon Stewart doesn't know that during Hillary Clinton's husband's tenure, they were dropping bombs on Iraq 2 or 3 times a week, killing people, right? I mean, like, it's so, all this stuff, and again, it comes back to watching Clinton and Rice there being politely interviewed, being allowed to say their side of it without any interjection. Why, it would have been great if you had on alongside Clinton, Noam Chomsky, or Medea Benjamin or somebody, right? I mean, who could explain these things and put them in context, or at least provide some kind of counter. But, and this is the problem. Then when you have that underlying narrative that, well, we're just fighting evil, right? And going back to particularly like this, when Clinton was talking about Libya, we had to, he's going to kill his people. What are the choices? You want to see him kill all his people? What are you going to do? That very simplistic rendering this into a Manichaean structure of, and I mean, because one thing, if I saw it once, I saw it 100 times, that makes me sick to my stomach. In those times, I was in the Pentagon before I went to Iraq, and I came back and I was at the State Department. So I was in all these offices and among senior people. I saw it once, I saw it 100 times or whatever. And in Baghdad as well, people would have these plaques that says evil prospers when good men stand still and do nothing. So you had all these people running around the American government thinking that they were fighting evil, thinking that they had the white hats on. And of course, but that actually goes back to then the understanding of who these people are, right? And these are people who believe that Francis Fukuyama and his End of History and Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations had it exactly right. So the people who are populating, say, Bush's cabinet and his senior people within the state, the Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, et cetera, these were all true believers in the American project, right? This idea that we are at the pinnacle of history and we have a duty to spread democracy. They really did believe it just as much as you had the Dick Cheney types who looked at Iraq and said, hey, man, I can divide this up between my friends at Halliburton, my friends at, Exxon, et cetera, et cetera.
When you entered the military, were you kind of in this frame of mind that we're the good guys standing up to fight the evil, or did these things, or were you kind of more aware of the nuances and complexities to some extent when you entered, or was your mind really changed as you experienced all this stuff?
I think I was guilty, as many people are, of thinking my generation was different, of understanding what had led. Understanding the American wars in Central America that I'd grown up seeing, understanding the Vietnam War, but thinking that my generation was different. And certainly this was post-Cold War. The idea that there would be wars again like Vietnam, we wouldn't do because we were smarter, we had learned, and just not really accepting the continuous line of history that runs, right? That runs, that we are a part of, whether we like it or not. And I think a lot of us fall in this trap of thinking our generation is somehow different. And, certainly that was not the case. That wasn't the case. We were exactly the same as everyone else was, but I think, in the late 90s, I went in January 1998, and there was this belief. Again, people thought that Fukuyama and Huntington got it right, with their End of History and their Clash of Civilizations. And there was this thought that what the American military would be doing going forward would be peacekeeping, would be stabilizing a world order, would be making the world safe for trade, and certainly understanding it, the American empire as a benevolent empire, as an economic empire. And that's certainly absolutely not the case whatsoever. If anything, the American empire is so curious because it has almost no financial or economic power in comparison to its military power. I'm not saying that the United States doesn't have economic power. Of course it does. But when you look at comparatively how the United States executes and performs in its foreign policy, it's almost all military, right? Yeah. I mean, like it is. So, I mean, but I think for me, yeah, it's something that I've thought a lot about. I've looked about, I've written a bit about it, this understanding of like, how could I have been so naive? How can I be so wrong about it? And, but I think that is something that is true for many generations, I mean, certainly I was a professional military officer, and I knew better than most about what the United States had done during the Spanish-American War, what our occupation of the Philippines was like. I mean, like I got all that. I knew the what we had done through this Central America. I understood. I had read Smedley Butler, right? I had embraced it. But again, I allowed myself to think that somehow we were different. And you do. So you take part in these things. You lie to yourself. You make justifications. You rationalize. You say that, like, okay, I'll be a moral actor. Thinking that somehow you'll have agency in the midst of something like a war, such a natural force, such a godlike occurrence as war is, where it is completely outside the control of man. You think that you're going to execute your individual moral agency. Well, I did.
Right.
Completely wrong. So then you say things, well, I'll bring people home alive, or I'm a junior person or a mid-level person. By the time when I'm a senior person, I won't let this happen again. But I can tell you, all through the late 90s and early 2000s, 2000 to 2001, I mean, I can tell you the amount of colonels and generals in the Marine Corps who would stand in front of you and say, and these are guys who had fought in Vietnam because they're still around. We're never going to let that happen again. Never going to let that happen again. And of course, they did. Twice,
right?
I think this is something that the summation of all it is that you have to stand on guard against it. We have to realize this is part of our nature. We have to realize the true reality of our empire, what it aims to do. You have to understand the people who are going to willingly populate that empire, who they are, their ambition, their immorality, their desire for control, whether it's greed or it's megalomania. Both are there. I think you go back to the Iraq War and you look at those who led that war. And I can tell you that a guy like Dick Cheney's reasons were different than Paul Wolfowitz's reasons, right? And both of them existed there as the key architects of that war. Right, and so you can have
what contrasted about their views on it.
Well, I think Cheney's was really, and then I think you also can add a third one in, Karl Rove, right? Where Karl Rove, who would say, hey, war is good for presidents. Wartime presidents win re-election, right? We just were attacked on 9/11. We have to do something. Okay, Afghanistan. We sent the troops into Afghanistan. We threw the Taliban out. But there's no news coverage anymore. There's no more fighting. Man, how are we going to get Bush reelected? And another war, a real war, that would be really good. I think the political types like Rove think that way. I think then you have the power types like Cheney, who view this as a power structure, particularly in the greed factors into all that as well. And power, greed, money, that's all interconnected for someone like that. So that's how you can have, right, where they have those secret meetings in 2002 about the energy plans. The Bush administration has these secret meetings about putting forward a new energy policy. And one of the things that's leaked out of those meetings is a map of Iraq that is no joke. It's divided up among different American energy companies. Exxon gets this point, right? I mean, so you have that. I mean, so you have the Cheneys like that. Like, hey, Cheney just came from Halliburton. What's the best thing for Halliburton? A war that's going to cost, eventually is going to cost however many trillions of dollars. That's the best thing for it. So you have all that, like in a Cheney, and then you have like the Wolfowitz types, right, who come out of Chicago School, who are a member of the Center, the PNAC, the Project for New American Security, right? I mean, so you have these men and women who are true believers in the American mission, right? Who believe in these Manichaean things, who do believe in the end of history and the class of civilizations. You see that among American generals. When you hear a guy like Jim Mattis talk about these things, the way he describes the Muslim world as borderlands, and the way he sees his role as kind of a modern day legionary who is going to be out there defending the empire against the barbarians. I mean, so you have all these different kind of mindsets that come into play, and then they all kind of are able to be presented because there is so much money underneath it. Because war can be incredibly popular. It can be very good for politics, and because people have romantic visions, and they do. There's a romance to this that can't be. I remember when, as the war was beginning in March of '03, and I was in the Pentagon, I was in the Secretary of Navy's office, and I remember going places, and the romance behind, oh my God, you're in the Marines. Oh, I wish I could do something like that. How honorable. Thank you for supporting a country, all this bullshit. And, but the amount of American flags that get put up and the romance of it. And it's like, we're all going to come home and there's going to be a Kenny Rogers song singing, and everything else. And it's like, there's that type of the atmosphere that it can engender. And that's been the case forever. That's been the case forever. I mean, go back to Rome and how they handled both going to war and, of course, the tributes that would occur, their celebrations that would occur. When the victory, the generals would return, or and a lot of those generals then turned into emperors. So there's so much to this. You can't just say it's one thing. Be nice if you could, but to be in that milieu, to undersee it and see all the intersection, and then of course the aspects of how what does that mean then in terms of speaking out against it, and what you're arrayed against, and the edifice that you are up against, this Leviathan that exists that is pro-war. I'll give Obama credit for saying, I think he said to Jeffrey Goldberg, there's a predilection for war, there's a preference for war within Washington, D.C., or there's a bias for war, or whatever he said, and it's true. But why is there a bias? Well, it's because there's so many that benefit from it. And it's because of the money, the power that it engenders, the ideological, the political beliefs, the megalomania that comes from it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you see that with the Ukraine war. I think you really see that clip out with the Ukraine war, where I think you can have the same things that allow for an Iraq war, allow for a Ukraine war as well. And Putin has those same things behind him as well. I mean? I think one of the things we struggle with so much with the Ukraine war here in this country is this concept that there can be no good guys, that all sides are bad. Right. In the same way the Iraq war was that way in many ways. No one who's arguing against the Iraq war or this operation of theft and organized murder that killed 1 million people. I'm not going to then say that Saddam Hussein, his government was somehow good. Both things can be true, but it's just where your perspective is. Who are you and what can you do about it? And so you can look at the Ukraine war and say, yeah, absolutely. Putin's invasion is criminal. It's brutal. It's terrible. He should be in The Hague, but also too, Bush and Obama should be in The Hague, and Biden and Trump as well. Right. I mean, and it's that type of nuance, that ability to have context, I think, is so hard.
Yeah. What I think you're kind of getting at in some ways, so like some people might say that these contrasting reasons for why people want to enter war, or the people that you worked with that believed that they were not going to do another Vietnam, and that we had a chance of winning this war and bringing democracy to these countries, that might contradict with the statement by Julian Assange that the goal of these wars is not to have a successful one, but an endless one, in order to transfer as much money as possible from the hands of taxpayer bases into the hands of a transnational elite. But I think that what really you're getting at is that these things don't contradict with it, because despite how many individuals contrast in their viewpoints on why we're at these wars, ultimately the system perpetuates what Assange was saying, right?
Right. And they complement each other. One allows the other to succeed. And certainly there are those, if you go into the boardroom of Boeing, certainly they want to see these wars go on forever. Right. If you go, however, into the Pentagon planning rooms and talk to the generals, they want victories. I mean, Petraeus didn't want to see the Afghan war, the Iraq war go on together. He wanted to win. He wanted the 5th star, right? I mean, you have to remember those things. These are men who see themselves as the greatest war fighters of their generation. In war, in American military and the Brits as well, there are generations of warfare, right? first, second, third, first generation. They're shooting at each other with muskets all lined up in rows, on and on and on. You know, Germans have their third generation of warfare or whatever it was. And, you know, I'm probably not even remembering it correctly. It's been so long since I've read that type of stuff. But, you know, this idea that we're in a fifth generation of warfare coming out of fourth generation of fifth generation, these are men like Petraeus and McChrystal and Mattis. They want to be this generation's Eisenhower. They want to be this generation's Robert E. Lee or Ulysses Grant. They want to be this generation's Napoleon. They want that type they want themselves on the mantle like that. These are very ambitious men, very dangerous in that way. You know, so you can't discount that they wanted to win, and they thought they could win because they believed in what they were able to accomplish. And then they surround themselves with sycophants who, you know, ignore reality, provide them only with the information that they want to hear. My friend Danny Davis, who I encourage people to look up Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, front page story on him in the New York Times in January or February 2012. You know, Danny went to Congress after he got back from Afghanistan with all kinds of classified documents saying, look, he lying to you. And of course, they paid him no attention. History has shown Danny to be absolutely correct in every way, you know. But what Danny saw, of course, what we all have seen is that the generals, you know, in a lot of ways know what they're told, but they set the mood for what they are going to be told, you know. And so, but you have a desire where they do think that they can win. They do think victory is possible. The stories you hear about General Wes Clark, when General Wes Clark says he went into the Pentagon in 2002, I guess it was fall of 2002, he relates his story and being told like by one of his previous subordinates, hey, sir, I just got this list of the 7 countries that we're going to invade and destroy over the next 7 years. And, you know, when I got to Iraq in spring of 2004, and I was at that point, the American embassy hadn't taken over yet. It was the Coalitional Provisional Authority under the Department of Defense. The things you would hear would be such like, well, after we finish up here, are we going to go right or left? Meaning, are we then going to go to Syria or are we going to go to Iran? You know, what's the next thing? And it certainly comes out of like what the people with the Project of New American Security, again, a guy like Wolfowitz comes out of, what they believed. And they have the reasons for believing. Some are, idealists. Some are romanticists. Some are see like America as being America and its liberal democracy being the pinnacle of history. And they have a responsibility to shape the world with it and to share it. Others see it more in a sense of defining borders and of security and the world's a dangerous place, and they believe those things. So we have to take out our rivals. Others, you know, will look at it and say, well, what's best for Israel is what's best for the United States. So if we get friendly regimes in these countries, that will help Israel, which will then help the Americans. You know what I mean? They see it that way, like, again, like it's a game of risk, you know, and so all that is there too. But then again, you can't discount any of the money that's behind it. You know, you can't discount any money because that money is massive and it's mammoth. I mean, hey, we're taping today on a Friday, right? Yesterday, the House of Representatives just authorized $858 billion, you know, for the Department of Defense. That's just for the Department of Defense. That's not for, you know, broken down veterans like me. That's not for the State Department. That's not for the CIA. That does include their nuclear weapons, actually. But like that $858 billion doesn't include a lot of the other parts of the American military machine, most especially the debt and interest payments that we spend every year on past military spending. Because remember that $858 billion, and anyone who knows me knows this is not my understanding of economics or monetary policy or how government's finances work. But you do understand that there is a debt that's being accrued, and that $858 billion has associated debt, just as the $14 trillion we've spent on the wars since 2001 have associated debt. You know, so every year the estimate is that the U.S. Congress pays about $170 billion a year on debt and interest payments for past military spending, right? So you have this circumstance where if you were to break out the American government by budget size, discretionary budget, not entitlements like, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those kind of things. That $170 billion or so we spend every year on interest and debt payments for past wars. The only two federal agencies that would be bigger than that are the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration. That's it. No one else is bigger than that. I mean, so you can put that in perspective, how much we're still spending for the wars for the last 20 years or so. So I mean, the amount of money is just massive, and that can never be just. But the same thing too, you can't discount what these people actually believe. Like I said, look at a Rove, a Mattis, a Wolfowitz, and a Cheney, and their reasons for all those wars are disparate and different, but they're all true too. They're all true in the sense of that this is what these people believe and this is what motivates them. And then there's a fifth reason as well, a fear of not going along, which is what Les Gelb says. Les Gelb, who's been around forever, foreign policy person, goes back to the Pentagon Papers and everything else. But Gelb was asked this a number of years ago. How come Washington, D.C. got the Iraq war so wrong? How come they got the Afghan war so wrong? How come they all got it so wrong? And Gelb said was because they're being left out. They're scared of not going along. So that's another reason, another number 5 there, right? Of like, why do people who know better go along? Well, they're scared. They're scared of being left out.
Yeah, and just to wrap up, you've been very generous with your time. I'm very curious as well about, we mentioned Julian Assange, see him right behind you there. I'm curious about his impact and his reporting that comes out during those years, all of that. What on the inside, how does that look? I mean, is he totally vilified as this person that's crazy? None of this is true. And, people must know about like all the money that you described. I mean, all that information, does it just turn into nothingness on the inside?
I think one of the things that the Department of Defense does in the wake of WikiLeaks is they institute what's called an insider threat program, which is to basically demonize anyone who's going to potentially be a whistleblower. And the insider threat program basically does not just an inducement to turning your fellow coworker who you think may be willing to be a whistleblower, who may be leaking classified documents, it's an instruction to do so. So there's not like there's an incentive to rat your buddy out. It's no, if you don't rat him out, you're going to Leavenworth as well, like that kind of thing. So that's how the institution handles it. It becomes very draconian, right? Where in a very, very trying to use fear to keep people in line, prevent another Chelsea Manning from happening, right? And of course, Ed Snowden happens, right? So, but in terms of like what WikiLeaks did and what Julian Assange did, is I think many people knew what the outlines of the wars were. It was kind of like a black and white drawing, and then what WikiLeaks certainly does is provide the color, provide the details. Well, we knew that, say with the torture, the handing over of Iraqis to the Iraqi security forces, knowing they full well were going to be tortured and killed by the American military. Well, we knew that Iraqis were disappearing. We knew that our people were picking people up, right? We knew we were capturing people, and then what would happen to them? Well, I don't know. The Iraqi security forces have them and everything else. But now you have the details of like, okay, well, no, we do know what actually occurred. They were tortured, they were killed, they were turned over to militias, whatever. I mean, so it was like that type of grandeur level, and certainly anyone familiar with the documents who've done work with classified documents, especially at the secret level, which is say what Chelsea Manning released, what she released, would know that the veracity is clear. These are honest documents. This is I mean, like for someone to duplicate all these or to make them up or to forge them, be impossible. Not on that scale. And I think that's one of the values of the scale of the release, was that it assured without any doubt the credibility of those documents, because there have been no way possible to produce that many I mean, and the thing is that, the Department of Defense went to great lengths to do two things. The first is better known about, even though it's hardly known at all. One is they had a general and he had, I don't know, 35 or 40 people underneath him. His job was to go and find the harm that was done by WikiLeaks, right? The harm that was, and in Chelsea's trial, and then of course in the extradition attempts by the American government with the British, the American government has not been able to show that any harm ever came from the release of these documents. No one was ever killed, let alone any harm. Certainly that's not the prevailing attitude. You'll hear members of Congress say this. You'll hear people in the media say, oh, the harm from it. No, there was no harm. We had a general, he had a huge staff, big staff, and they spent years looking for this stuff, and they couldn't find anything. If they could have found it, they could have made something up. They probably would have, but they couldn't. And then the other part of it was that this was fake, right? That this, that this is untrue. And nothing that WikiLeaks has ever put out has ever been shown to be fake. Right? Whether it's this stuff, whether it's the stuff that they put out about other governments, about corporations, about politicians, I'm not aware of anything where they have what they've put out has been shown to be a forgery, a fake, not to be trusted. So you may not like what they're saying. It may be hurtful to hear this about your preferred government, about your preferred corporation, about your preferred politician or political party. But the reality is that those documents are real, So I think with WikiLeaks, the service that it has done, what Julian has done, in putting forward so much detail, not just about the Iraq War, the Afghan War, but about American foreign policy in general, and showing its purposes as well as showing what it knows it's doing has just been, it's something that, this is why they want to kill him. This is why I don't believe the American government truly wants to extradite him. I think they really hope that he dies in Belmarsh. One, I don't think they want a trial here, even though it would be a secret trial in a lot of ways. I don't think they want something going all the way to the Supreme Court about this. Particularly, you just saw the New York Times came out against his extradition. Others will eventually, I believe. But the other thing is that if he dies in Belmarsh, what a signal that sends to other journalists not to step out of line. That's the best of both worlds for the American government. They don't have a ruling against them. And in Supreme Court ruling against them, but they also but they still maintain like this warning to journalists not to step out of line, or else what happened to Assange will happen to you.
Yeah, that's a very strong note that I think it could be great to end on. We want to thank you, Matt Hoh, for coming on and talking with us. You're an indispensable voice of reason and rare voice. And we hope to have you back on soon as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Anytime. Thanks, Max and Diego. Appreciate it.